Greetings and welcome to the World News Jam here on DZRJ and RJ TV. My name is Eric Lecain. Here on the Jam, I tell interesting stories about what's going on in the world this week, so thank you for joining us. Things that I find interesting, hopefully you will too. This week, we'll be talking about those new guns that Taiwan is getting, story of Mikhail Gorbachev, updates on the most dangerous thing facing the U.S. right now. Does China have enough people? And what happens after you escape death in North Korea? All right here on the World News Jam on RJ TV, DZRJ. So let's get to it. Remember when Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, third in line to the U.S. presidency, decided to take a vacation in Taiwan, but then it wasn't really a vacation. She met with the leaders of Taiwan and said that the U.S. would always be there to back the Taiwanese against threats from China. Remember that? How the Chinese decided to run military drills while she was there? Some good old-fashioned Chinese intimidation. Well, here we go again. The Biden administration has agreed to sell $1.1 billion in military equipment to the Taiwanese. And this is not some pistols and nice camouflage uniforms. No, this is military stuff that is basically just for combating China. Stuff you look at and go, what's that for? And the answer is, it's just in case China does what they say that they're going to do. Remember, we were talking about the ifs and whens China will use military force to retrieve Taiwan, that it would probably wait until it could shore up enough support from some other countries, such as Russia, so it doesn't have to go it alone. But the problem with waiting is that Taiwan would have a better chance of increasing its military capabilities. That as China was waiting for the right time, it might come to the point where China's military would be too hard to defeat. Seems fairly reasonable that Taiwan is looking at the war in Ukraine, realizes that the only way the Ukraine is able to defend itself from a massive adversary such as Russia is with creating allies in the West. Now, Russia easily rolled into the Ukraine because it thought it would be easy to take over, not thinking that the U.S. and Europe would be giving such a helping hand of weapons to them to combat the overeager Russians. And now the Russians have gotten themselves in a place where they can't move forward and they can't go back. But how different would it be if the Russians had have known how helpful the West was going to be to the Ukrainians? Would they have rushed in so willy-nilly if they knew the U.S. was going to be sliding the Ukraine some of those surface-to-air missiles and those ship-destroying bombs and those super cool mini drone systems? Taiwan wants to make sure that China knows this is not going to be easy. They want it very publicly known what they have and what they would use in case China attacked. The package from the U.S. is sending to Taiwan includes a $655 million radar warning system, $355 million worth of Harpoon missiles, the kinds that can sink a military ship. Also, some of those Sidewinder surface-to-air and air-to-air missiles. Remember these things? Once they are in the air, they will follow the target. Even if it misses, they will turn around and go after the target, just like in any one of those Tom Cruise movies. So, this has been publicly announced by the U.S. Pentagon. It could have been secretly done. However, I don't think that they want to keep it a secret, because right after they announced it, China immediately said that they would take countermeasures unless the deal was rescinded. The spokesman for the Chinese embassy said it firmly opposed the sales and that it will severely jeopardize the Chinese-U.S. relations and the peace stability across the Taiwan Strait. It called on Washington to immediately revoke the weapons sale. Now, this is coming from China, who has continued to stir the pot in the area for the last year, sending flybys with its military jets and running drills, which are not that different from the drills Russia claimed it was running just before it invaded. China sees this as the U.S. interfering in its own internal affairs. That, of course, that Taiwan is their territory and the U.S. has no right to change the balance of power. The Chinese spokesman said that if the U.S. interferes in China's internal affairs, it undermines China's sovereignty and security by selling arms to Taiwan. He goes on, it sends the wrong signals to the Taiwan independent separatist forces. Now, what does this sound like? Kind of sounds like the same argument that Russia used as its excuse to invade the Ukraine. Russia is saying that it's not that it's independent democratic country. However, it's Russia. It's Russia that's just defending itself against this handful of separatists in the Ukraine. Also, China pulled that old talking point that the U.S. needs to honor its commitment to the one China policy. It's always like it has to bring that up because, in essence, the United States did commit to that policy that even though the world sees Taiwan and China as two separate nations, the U.S. policy-wise still sees it as one nation. But the reality is that even though they say they have agreed to the Chinese policy, they also agreed to protect Taiwan from any threats, including, and most obviously, pointing over to China. Now, Taiwan, which is the small fry in this battle between these two heavyweights, has spoken out this week, which to me seems very pre-planned by them. They said that it highly welcomes the latest arms deal and thanked the U.S. government for continuing to implement the security commitments to Taiwan. That in response to China's recent continuous military provocations and unilateral changes in the status quo, thus creating crises, Taiwan is determined to defend itself. And that is extremely firm. In other words, China, you started it. Because of all this military movement right in Taiwan's backyard, China, you have brought this on yourself. If you would just have let the status quo continue, all would have been fine, but you couldn't leave well enough alone, and now we have Sidewinder surface-to-air missiles that we will shoot at you. Just this past Thursday, the Taiwanese shot down a Chinese drone that was hovering over one of the island's outposts, and this comes after it had warned off drones hovering over 3 other island outposts. The problem, as I said before, is in case of an accident. I mean, if one side shoots down a drone and the other feels compelled to shoot their missile, but let's say someone was working at that site where the missile shot that day, or someone was tending a field under a drone when they shot it down, and that civilian, well, gets killed. Whose fault's that going to be? I'm sure that each will blame the other, and of course, then the U.S. will be coupled into that blame. This is very much like the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and then it's nothing like it. Ukraine claimed autonomy back in the days of Gorbachev, but Putin wants it back, saying that it belongs to Russia and should have never gained its independence in the first place. In this case, however, between China and Taiwan, their civil war actually never ended. Even though Taiwan is a democratic free society, it has never officially been able to declare its independence officially, even though it has unofficially. And China has never and never will accept that. According to them, Taiwan has always been and will always be part of China. This is a real problem that the Chinese has waited too long to retrieve its province. It would be different if Taiwan was a poor, defenseless nation, but it's not. They currently feed the world with their microchips, and the world doesn't really like the idea of China having control of that. So now we are in a stalemate. China keeps poking a stick at Taiwan, and Taiwan keeps buying modern weapons. What happens if a new U.S. president, or even the current president, decided to change their official policy on Taiwan and side with a good part of the rest of the world that Taiwan is an independent nation? What if the U.S. says, okay, Taiwan is pretty strong militarily now, so we will just back it as a free and independent nation? Will China then move forward on its threats? Will it go up against the rest of the world as it tries to take back its old province? And will it ask for help from anyone else? Let's say a power that has a nuclear arsenal. Will they form alliances with the Middle East? And what about small countries in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines? How quickly this could spiral out of control. We think that we know what's going to happen, but leaders of countries do change, and so does the world with it. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Mikhail Gorbachev has passed away this week there in Russia. So, who was Mikhail Gorbachev? Well, first of all, he is considered one of the top 100 most influential people that has ever lived. Most notably, he helped end the Cold War. The Cold War was really a war of politics between the US and the Soviet Union. Lots of threatening and line drawing, but mostly just that. See, after World War II and the first and only dropping of an atomic bomb, the race to see who could make the most nuclear bombs was on. Over the next 50 years, there was always the threat of nuclear annihilation and had people buying up gas masks and radar detectors and building bomb shelters. But the nuclear bombs never flew, only the thoughts of them. And eventually, calm, clear heads took over the Cold War and found its end. One of the most important people in facilitating that end was Mikhail Gorbachev. He, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the US President Ronald Reagan finally put an end to the Cold War. Gorbachev had trouble at first convincing the world that nuclear weapons were not the future if the world was going to continue to exist. But finally, he got Reagan to say the USSR was not the US's evil enemy, and that we could live together and help each other without the threat of killing each other. Gorbachev shocked the world when he told the US General Assembly that he was removing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and thousands of tanks from Eastern Europe. Previous leaders had sent the soldiers and tanks to shore up the Kremlin-backed dictatorships, but Gorbachev realizes that this was wrong. He said the USSR had no right, moral or political, to interfere in other countries. This move paved the way for those Eastern countries to become independent of Russia. Gorbachev became the leader in 1985, and with that, he inherited, I would say, a host of problems. The economy was slowing down and consumer goods were hard to find. People were losing their faith in communism. When he came into power, he made a decision to try and help the common man whose living standards were declining. One of those was to move away from communism and move toward democratization, to restructure the country and improve relations with the West. One example was he allowed journalists to speak out with their own mind, to finally be able to write freely without the fear of the government killing them. The best example was during the incident at Chernobyl nuclear plant. People were allowed to report the truth and debate the issue openly. This was a huge step out of the waters of communism, allowing people to speak their own mind and not that of the party, to embrace individualism and competition. This was a turning point, especially in the parts of Eastern Europe being controlled by the Soviets. This later had a profound effect on the future makeup of Europe. People began to do things they would have never thought to do before, such as protest the government. This is a complete turnaround of the previous ways of life, back when your movements and decisions were all controlled by the government, where your purchases were restricted, where freedom of speech was limited to what the government said you could say. And this all led to a landmark moment in history to remove a wall of division. Remember back, it was 1961 that Nikita Khrushchev had a barbed wire fence put right down the middle of Germany. This was to divide the East from the West. The idea of this wall was to stop the West from bringing its ideals and democracy closer to the East. At the time, they did not want freedom of thought and expression. They did not want democracy. This was a new era of the Iron Curtain. And later, this was built into a wall which was meant to not only keep the West from moving closer to the East, but to keep the population of East Germany from escaping to the West. But as Gorbachev ideas began to take hold, the people's strength increased and the Soviet-backed dictators across Europe were being pressured. But in 1989, during a huge protest at the wall, something happened that, well, wasn't really supposed to happen. As an East German leader decided that to calm the people, he would loosen the rules about going across the border to make it easier to get a visa. There was no intention to open the border, just to calm the people from protesting. But at the press conference, the spokesman got confused. It turned out he didn't have a chance to prep for the conference and read a quote that he was handed that said private travel outside the country will be applied for without prerequisite. The reporters were stunned. Even the spokesman that was speaking was stunned. He shuffled through his papers but could not find any information about this. Actually, what was meant to be announced was that starting tomorrow, people could apply for a visa to travel across the border. But that's not what everyone heard. So thousands upon thousands of people ran to the gate, to the border, trying to leave because they thought now that you could. The man in charge of the border, he called his superiors, "Do I open the gate or do I start shooting at the crowd?" But there was just a handful of guards and thousands of people and more coming. So he opened the gate. And those incredible moments of film that came as the Iron Curtain went tumbling down, Gorbachev's ideas for having an open society came. However, they came much, much faster than anyone had anticipated. Hungary dismantled 150 miles of barbed wire. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania formed a massive human chain reaching 370 miles across the Baltic republics, calling for independence. Czechoslovakia had so many people trying to cross over to the West that they had to close it for a bit just to allow the embassy to catch up. This sparked the fuse that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev allowed citizens to voice their minds and their hearts. This created movements across the region as the Baltic states called for the right to secede from the USSR. Very soon after, the Ukraine announced its independence. But as the republics were moving away from the Soviet Union, it itself was starting to become unhinged. The USSR was coming apart and was beginning to destabilize. In the center of all of it was Gorbachev. He realized that he had to renegotiate the relationship between Russia and the other republics, but it was already too late. The communist hardliners of the Soviet Union didn't want any of this to continue, so they staged a coup against Gorbachev. When Gorbachev was on his Christmas vacation in Crimea, the coup was set in motion. Gorbachev resigned on Christmas Day. His dream of creating a bond with the West was over, but he was responsible indirectly or directly for bringing down a wall that divided those who are free from those who are not free. Putin has heavily criticized Gorbachev as the leader who initiated the biggest geopolitical catastrophe in a century. And as you could imagine, Gorbachev was not a big fan of Putin. He vehemently disagreed with the invasion of Ukraine, describing it as an obstacle to progress. So don't expect Gorbachev to be getting a state funeral of any kind or a national honor. As we tend to see in the current Russia, history is created by the ones in power. And currently, Gorbachev will go down in history in this Russia as the leader during which crime was rampant, there was mass unemployment, and everyone lost their money when the banks collapsed. But the West will always remember him as the one who helped instigate the fall of the wall of idealism. Someone who saw a need to focus more on the well-being of the people and less on whether they had the most nuclear weapons. His legacy will be mixed. People will argue that he brought chaos and instability, and there are others that will say his has brought freedom and the ideals of democracy to the region. The debate was immortalized in a Pizza Hut commercial as a family argues about it over a large pizza. In the end, they realized that the only way they were currently eating Pizza Hut pizza was because of Gorbachev. So even though now all the Western restaurants have moved out of Russia in protest to the war in Ukraine, for a brief moment in history, Russians have Gorbachev to thank for the greasy, saturated foods of the West. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Thank you so much for joining us here on Sunday evening. Okay, let's get to a quick update on what's going on with the issues around the U.S. former President D. Trump. As we know, the FBI executed a warrant in Trump's Florida home a few weeks ago, and literally every day after that, there has been something in the news about it. Now, what's new this week is not so much that Trump stole classified documents when he left the White House. What's big this week is that he may have purposely tried to hide the documents from the U.S. government. Now, months ago, when the government asked Trump for the classified documents that he is known to have taken, he turned over some. But the problem was he personally went through those documents and actually picked out ones that he wanted to keep. When the government realized that many of the documents were missing, they asked for the rest. They even went to his home and asked for them back. But one of Trump's lawyers said that Trump had given back all the documents. Now, that turned out not to be true in a big way, as we have seen from all the super classified documents the FBI retrieved in their raid. But here's the problem. If Trump had left out some of the documents accidentally, that would be one thing. But he purposely tried to hide them. Well, that would constitute obstruction, and that is a crime in the U.S. Some of the classified documents were found in boxes with clothes, some mixed in with gifts and newspaper clippings. But some of the documents Trump took out of storage, locked them in his desk and in his personal safe, which is where the FBI found some of them, which does not seem to be an accident. And in some cases, folders were found with the word classified stamped on them, but then nothing was in them. So where are those documents now? Did Trump remove them from their folder, or did someone else remove them? Or were there none in there to begin with? So here comes the problem of obstruction. Was Trump trying to obstruct the government's investigation into whether he illegally removed documents from the White House? Now, Trump's lawyers were in court this week trying to argue that there needed to be a special monitor put in place to check all the documents so that public opinion might not totally distrust the process. However, the DOJ said that we don't need a special monitor because we already checked all the documents and there's no need to bring in a third party to look over things because we've already done it, and this stunt would just slow down the process even more. Now, the judge in that has deferred till later for his decision. The lawyers argue that some of the documents may have privileged information and that they need a third party to really determine that. Of course, this sounds like a way for Trump to put delays on the process, because if he can just delay it until November, there could be a chance that the Republicans would take over Congress and yada, 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 I go free again. So the judge is going to give us the word on the special master later, and whether there will be one assigned to this case. But the interesting thing is that the judge will decide if we can have a better idea of what the FBI took from Trump's home. For weeks now, we have been speculating on what is in those documents, how dangerous or not dangerous that they are. Now, Trump himself said, well, we were really mad this week because of a photo that was released from the FBI showing all those documents spread out on the floor of his home, just showing the highly classified stamping on each one of them. Trump claims it was all staged, although I'm not exactly sure what he means by that. Exactly how could the FBI stage something like this? What are they actually staging? These documents that Trump took from the White House, that clearly he was not supposed to take. So now many are saying that It could be that the documents are really not that classified and that the word is being loosely used here, the word being classified, but as it's been explained, some of the documents may not seem all that secret. However, how the government office got them, that's what's interesting. How did the CIA get these documents, get this information? This is where it does take an expert to determine this. Does Kim Jong-un like milkshakes? That's not very classified. However, do we know how we know that Kim Jong-un likes milkshakes? Now, for a week, Trump's dudes have been saying, well, Trump declassified the documents before he took them. However, when they were in front of the judge, they didn't mention that at all. That part might be because they already had come out to say that that defense is absolutely ludicrous, that Trump cannot declassify documents, and besides, he wasn't even president at the time. This all comes as Trump's own head of the DOJ spoke out on this matter, saying that Trump was jerking people around. He went after Trump's talking points that this was unprecedented, that the DOJ would go after an ex-president. Bill Barr, he said, well, it's unprecedented that a president would take classified documents and put them in a country club. And how long is the government going to try to get them back? They were deceived by voluntary action, that they were deceived during the subpoena. The facts were showing that they're being jerked around by Trump. He also said that the Justice Department had a pretty good evidence before the raid, so they had a right to do it. Now, Trump, being the guy that he is, not to be outdone, this week said that Bill Barr is a Republican in name only, that he has no guts, no glory, that he is a weak, pathetic rhino, that Barr was weak when it came to the election integrity, that he lacked courage and stamina, that people like that will never make America great again, and said something about his mishandling of the laptop. Hell, I assume he's talking about Hunter Biden's laptop. In any case, the usual stuff that Trump usually says. He will talk about everything except the actual subject. And that's why he removed classified documents from the White House. And also, when you call someone a rhino, is that a bad thing? Anyway, everyone is in court this week waiting to hear from the judge about the next step in the evolution of this case against Trump. Now, in case you had not noticed, Trump also has been speaking out against the January 6th hearing this week. Yeah, that's not over yet. Those at the opening of the hearings in which Congress is talking about Trump's involvement in the riot on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. This week, one of the rioters got 10 years in prison for attacking a police officer with a flagpole. Trump came out and said that if he were elected president again, he would seriously consider pardoning people that attack the Capitol, which is interesting in many ways. The most obvious one is that a group of his supporters broke into the Capitol, chanting words about plans to kill U.S. officials. People were beaten, some died, tons of damage was done, all to try and prove something that we all know to be untrue, that Trump won the election, which he didn't. These are people that he's now claiming that he maybe will pardon if he's elected again. Maybe. Trump said, what's happening to them is a disgrace. Now, just to be clear, if I had rushed into the U.S. Capitol yelling to kill the vice president, or set up a scaffold with a hangman's noose, or smashed windows, or beat up policemen, smeared my poop on the walls of the Capitol, I would most likely be in jail right now. So I'm a little confused as to why Trump believes it's okay to do this. I mean, I guess it's okay as long as you're supporting him. But in any case, the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, and his deputy will be speaking under oath coming up this week about that subject. He was the guy that said something to the effect of, during the riot, we are breaking every law imaginable. But Trump was not only the only one speaking out this week. Some of the other people that were speaking out were Joe Biden, the guy who actually is the president now. This week, he said something that we don't hardly ever see him do, talking about Trump. He, for the most part, ignored the ex-president and focused on getting legislation passed, which has had some big wins recently, but this week he could not hold his 80-plus-year-old tongue back and let it loose against the U.S. ex-president. He first took a smack at Trump's Republicans by saying they thrive on chaos, and he gave us a warning that their attempts to undermine democracy would devolve into violence. He said, they live not in the light of truth, but in the shadow of lies. As I stand here tonight, he said, equality and democracy are under assault. We do ourselves no favor to pretend otherwise. He was very careful to set the divide between the Republicans and the MAGA people, or the diehard Trump supporters, whatever you want to call them, saying the MAGA forces are taking the country backwards to a time when Americans did not have the right to choose, no right to privacy, no right to contraception, no right to marry who you love. They promote authoritarian leaders and fan the flames of violence, saying that what is happening in America is simply not normal. And this is mostly because of Donald Trump. I mean, one thing I have seen different between the office of the president during Trump's time and now Biden's time is now the U.S. presidency is way more boring. Biden is focused on policy, passing legislation, trying to rebuild allies around the world. News-wise, it's a really big yawn. Trump gave an OMG moment every week he was in the presidency. Trump had more scandals in 4 years than all the other presidents combined. And he's been out of office nearly 2 years, and he is still having scandal after scandal. He was impeached twice, investigated on the deadly attack into the U.S. Capitol. He's under civil suits. He's under criminal suits. His close advisors are being indicted, and the FBI just raided his house. I mean, Biden, Obama, George Bush, they were all incredibly boring next to Trump. But the question is, shouldn't the president really just be kind of boring? I mean, they should be in the news sometime, but not every single day. Trump was not in the news for passing policy. He actually hardly passed anything during his time as presidency, mostly because he was always tweeting about all of his scandals. I mean, every president tells lies sometimes, but the newspaper had a running tally of the lies Trump told. It was a bit of a joke to Americans, and also not a joke at the same time. I mean, foreign leaders are no longer getting caught making fun of the U.S. president or mocking him or outright calling him a fool. We no longer have to look at foreign countries creating giant balloons showing the U.S. president as a baby wearing a diaper. I mean, right now, we're going back to boring. Same as before the Trump era, when once a month the news would say, oh, the president did this, and we would only really hear from the president if there was some major foreign issue. And that would only last maybe a day, maybe a week. Gone now seems to be the days when the president said or did something crazy just to get himself in the news. And people would say, oh goodness, what did he do now? But what Biden said went beyond the usual joke we say about Trump and really went at the people supporting him. Now, the Republicans came out and said Biden is trying to divide the country with his speech hating the people that support Trump, which actually seems to be true in many ways. This speech did draw a line between Republicans and Democrats and MAGA people. The Make America Great Again group. I mean, before, in an election, you were on one side or the other. You either won or you lost. That's democracy. You have an election and one side wins and one side loses. However, with Trump's crowd, democracy is out the window. There are only two sides. Either you win or you were cheated, and that's it. Biden claimed that we are in a fight for our democracy, and there's currently a person that wants to tear it down. If it seems like a little extreme, it's because, well, it kind of is. Democracy cannot survive if this is the path that the country is going down. You just only love your country if you win. That if we lose, then the election must be illegitimate. We have a right to change it any way we see fit. What Biden was saying is that this kind of thinking is dangerous. He spoke about how the Trump supporters are gearing up for the upcoming election, how many of the Republicans are already saying that if I lose, then it was the Democrats cheating me and the election is a fraud. This is coming a month before the election has even happened. That in the last election, Trump's people tried everything they could think of to overthrow the election, even using violence. And the nation of America cannot allow this to happen again. The violent riot that happened on the Capitol was the first time that something like that has ever happened in America. This was not like in 1861. In that time, peaceful transfer of power was interrupted, but not like this. This was the first time that a party voted to overturn the votes of an election with zero proof of why they are doing it. Only use the word of an ex-president who was voted out of office by the people. This was Biden's speech. He does not give speeches like this. Sometimes we will believe things if we are told enough times to believe it. If something is said over and over and over, it starts to become plausible, even if indeed we know that it's a lie. So will this speech have an impact on the people that look at the government and wonder who they should believe? Very soon the U.S. will have to make a choice between, well, the boring and the dangerous. This is Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ. So remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the fact that Russia is not getting bigger and is actually getting smaller. So while they are trying to increase their land by waging wars on other countries, people back home in the motherland are not becoming, well, mothers. Having babies is way down in Russia. Women are not just knocking them out in Russia like they used to. Part of that has to do with the fact that poverty there is making it harder and harder to justify having more kids. Now, Putin had this brilliant idea of giving away 1 million Russian rubles if a woman would have more children. But the problem with that scheme is that you must have 10 kids and they all must be living. And the fact that 1 million rubles is about $16,000. And the fact that you have to have all 10 kids to get the money. And how long does it take to have 10 kids, etc., etc. Now, before that story, we actually talked several times about the population problem in Japan. In Japan, they have experienced a large decline in population growth over the past decade. However, in Japan, women just don't want to get married and don't want to have babies in the traditional way anymore. In Japan, it's expensive to live and just too expensive to have a baby. Women currently are feeling the need to work and have careers rather than have a baby and stay at home in the old traditional way. As I said, Japan can be very expensive, especially in the city, so women have been choosing work. In fact, 1 in 4 in their 30s are saying marriage is not for them. Then they just don't want social obligations. They don't want to be tied down. That's a huge difference from the Japanese woman of the 70s and the 80s. Now, the government has a plan which does make a bit more sense than the Russian one in that they will offer women more alternatives for childcare so they can continue to work and have a career and have a baby. It's called the Angel Plan. The main goal is to make it easier for women to have children. Improved housing for expecting mothers, better child care services available by the government, more improvements and lower costs to education. Also, the new +1 plan will encourage families to add 1 to the home unit by adding incentives. By the way, this does not include adding a dog, cat, or a fish. It's only for babies. There are 50,000 new daycare facilities in the plans to be built. So Japan is really trying to figure out how to deal with this problem for the future of having babies. But this story is not really about the baby problem in Russia or the baby problem in Japan. It's really about the last place on earth you would think that would have a population problem. It's China. What? China doesn't have a population problem. Don't they have too many people there? Okay, so years ago, I did a story on how popular abortions had become in China. That because of the ability to see the sex of the baby at an early age in the pregnancy, and because people were limited to one child only at that time, people would immediately abort the baby if they found out that it was a girl. Why do the Chinese hate girls so much? Because it's the culture of China, not far from the Philippine culture. The children take care of the parents when they get old. But unlike the Philippines, China had set up certain laws limiting families to only one child. So they thought that if you have a girl, she will marry into another family and will be obligated to take care of her husband's family, and you will be left to grow old alone. So no one wanted to have girls. Now, the problem with that is it happened 30 years ago. Now we are 30 years later. The way human evolution works is genetically, or by the grace of God, male and females are fairly born on an equal basis. You have the same chance of being born a boy as you do a girl. The problem in China is that they were artificially messing with the genetic scheme, thus making more boys than girls. So now they are all grown up and there's just not enough girls to go around. The other problem is, somewhat like Japan, women just don't want to get married. They want to work. They want to have careers just like men. This is the new China, where there are not many opportunities for women to excel in business. In the last year, China had the fewest marriages that they have ever had since they started keeping records. In 2021, China had 7.6 million marriages. Seems like a lot, doesn't it? Until you see that that's a 6.1% decrease as compared to the previous year. And the 8th consecutive year, the marriage rates have fallen. Another interesting fact is that the age of people that are actually getting married has moved to the 30s. Like in Western societies, people are simply waiting to get married. And in the millennial groups, people are choosing not to get married or have children at all. 2013 to 2019, the number of couples getting married in their 20s dropped 41%. This is eventually going to create a big problem in China economically, because eventually this is going to make a dent in the workplace. The one thing that has boomed China's economy in the last 20 years is its ability to manipulate the working class, the ability to produce products at an unbelievably low rate and to do it cheaply and ship it to the eager buyers of the West. It wasn't before too long that the working class manufacturing had all but dried up in the U.S. and had moved almost all of its operations to China. They can just make things so fast. Some would say the only way to be competitive was to utilize the Chinese workforce. But this is now starting to change. China has realized that they feed the world with cheaply made, high-priced basketball shoes and are utilizing its labor laws. But what if for some reason there was no more of those factory workers to fill what they need? What if there was all of a sudden a shortage of workers for the existing plants and none for the new plants, and all because there just wasn't enough babies being born? Just seems so ironic how this is turning out. China for so long had a one-child policy, and many experts warned this could cause a bad effect in the long term. Now China has quickly changed its policy to a three-child policy. And even so, the birth rates have continued to plummet. Last year, China added only 480,000 babies, and that's the lowest in decades. And with people over 60 being 1/5 of the population and living longer, this means that in the first time since the Great Famine of 1961, the population of China will decrease. There are fewer births than there are deaths in China now. So what's China going to do now that they have a 30 million surplus in their population? So now that China has changed its policy on women being able to have more than one child. Well, why isn't that working? It's not working because after so many years of having the one-child policy and women being charged as criminals for having more than one child, women are simply saying, too bad. The move to a policy allowing women to have more children is just not going to work. It's funny, a satirist wrote that the Irish famine would have been fixed if people would just eat the babies. This is not far from what the Chinese have been doing for decades. But now that women are more educated, less likely to be forced into marriages in order to produce a specific kind of child to better the Communist Party, now that women are no longer considered leftovers if they're not married by in their 20s, now that women can more or less make their own choices for having children in China, things are going to take a while to fix themselves. After China lifted in 2016 on the one-child policy, they are also beginning changing the norms for discrimination against women having babies while working. Currently, you can still be fired for getting pregnant in China. So I don't think China is going to have a population problem anytime soon. However, the fact that the new few childbearing age women in China has become so small might be time to start to cater to them. Maybe come up with some incentives other than, aren't you happy now that we're letting you have more than one child? If they don't, China may end up having a country of just men. And we all know men can't have babies. Well, not yet anyway. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We're talking about interesting stories going on around the world. So, what happens when you defect from North Korea? Since 1998, there have been more than 33,000 people that have defected from the North to the Southern Korea. And it's pretty hard to do because you can't just run across the border. There's a very good chance that you will be shot. You can cross into China, but there's a good chance you will be sold into sex slavery or even sold to be, to some North Korean where they will get a reward and you will get imprisoned, mostly tortured. You will probably die. Getting out of North Korea is not that easy. But let's say that you do get out. What do you do then? If you're under 50 and you've been in a controlled environment your entire life, you have never seen the outside world. You have probably never even seen the internet. You have no idea what the world is like. Only what you have seen in one of the poorest, most dangerous countries in the world, North Korea. So what if you were one of the ones that escaped from North Korea? What are you doing? Well, what they're doing is they're talking. They're telling their stories of living on the other side. And this is making them stars. Well, what I should say is it's making them YouTube stars. Take, for instance, Kang Nara. She had never even seen the internet in her entire life. She grew up in a country where the internet is banned. YouTube, Instagram, Google, all banned. But now she's in South Korea, and the 25-year-old has 350,000 subscribers and rakes in millions of views to her videos. She has sponsorships from Chanel and Puma. She is what you call a YouTube sensation. And she's just one of many North Korean defectors who, after escaping, have found a new life on social media. She, as well as others, have found a great popularity talking about the life in the hermit nation. Maybe what food they ate or their daily routines. Some talk about the politics of North Korea and their relationships with other countries. Some talk about the culture. But it's turned out to be one of the hottest, most entertaining subjects in Korea. Many of this new breed of influencers are saying that it's not just a way of finding financial independence, but it's giving them a sense of self-representation and a way to find their way in the new world. Now, Kang Nara fled as a teenager back in 2014. She said that it was very tough at first, loneliness, culture shock, financial problems, that the super competitive job market in South Korea is even worse for defectors, and many local Koreans really don't want them there in the first place. Turns out that defectors are twice as likely not to be employed as local people in South Korea, but things began to change for her when she discovered that people are very fascinated with defectors. There's actually several shows devoted to hosting defectors. There are two popular ones. One's called Now On My Way to Meet You, and the other one is called Morin Bong. Kang has been on both of those shows, and it's that where she was discovered about being that she found that by being North Korean, she can in some ways become a celebrity. So she created her own YouTube channel, began talking about her daily life, the things that she did. She talks about the differences between the North and the South. For instance, in the North, large boobs are considered not beautiful. However, in the South, people use padded bras and get implants. She also talks about what you bring when you're defecting. Here's what you bring as a defector. You bring salt for luck. You bring a family photo for comfort, and you bring rat poisoning in case you're caught. It's better to take it than to go back to North Korea. The show is so popular that she's now being represented by several management companies. She has video producers and has attracted sponsors for her content. She said, "I have a steady flow of income now, and I can buy and eat whatever I want." She's not the only North Korean to find such financial success on YouTube. Several others are jumping on the YouTube wagon, and it's mostly because they are having a hard time in South Korea in the job market, and the culture is not that easy to adhere to as you might think. In any case, it gives them an outlet to speak again about what has happened in their lives after fleeing the North. Now, there are some that criticize these shows on the television, saying that it's really South Korean producers that are making up the content and just capitalizing on the defectors. This is why many of these defectors are just doing YouTube now. It's a chance to tell their own story in their own way. It's a way to really explain what life is really like without sensationalizing it. Some feel it's a way to bridge the gap between the North and the South. Right now, relations between the countries are at an all-time low. People in the South fear the North for obvious reasons. They keep testing missiles. In the North, it's constantly seeing the South running military drills with the U.S. Neither side trusts the other. This is something that seems that will never end, at least, well, not in the near future. But maybe these North Korean YouTubers can at least give the world a slight glimpse into a life of living in North Korea, of living in a place where every day you think about escape, where you have nothing but poverty and suffering, where the government rules your life and makes your decisions for you, where you can never speak your mind or less be imprisoned, where you can spend a lifetime never seeing YouTube, and where having Korean K-pop videos can get you thrown in prison and even executed. This is a world that they want you to see, that maybe North Koreans are not to be hated or felt sorry for, but realize that they do not represent the country from which they have come from. Maybe this is a way to bring the two sides closer. One thing that you seem to hear from many defectors from the North is this is how they believe that they can show people what the North is like and somehow bridge that gap. They wish for one day to see the two Koreas brought together again, if not by politics, then, well, maybe by YouTube. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We'll be back again next week with more interesting stories from around the world, so please tune in then. For now, me, Eric Lecain, here on DZRJ. Everybody be safe out there, and we will see you next week.